At this time, the company has no further witnesses and no questions. Does the union have any further questions or any other witnesses to produce?
No, sir.
At this time, then, I would like to ask Mr. Blanton, do you have any questions or any witnesses you would like to call?
No, sir.
All right, very well. At this time, then, Mr. Blanton, as I prepare to close this hearing, I would like to ask you, have you been afforded the opportunity to ask all questions you wanted to ask, and do you believe that you've been afforded a fair and impartial hearing?
Objection, Mr. Hearing Officer. The organization would like the opportunity to make a closing statement, and we believe that's appropriate, and we would request a brief recess to prepare that closing statement.
I will allow the union to make a closing statement, but first, Mr. Blanton, if you would answer my question, then we'll be happy to move on and allow the union to make a closing statement.
I'll answer the question as his representative. We will allow the record to speak for itself.
Very well. And at this time, the union would like a recess?
Yes.
How long would you like?
Just a couple of minutes.
We are in recess for 2 minutes. All right, the time is 2:58 p.m., and we are back on the record. Mr. Hollis.
Sure. So the organization would first like to repeat the objections that we raised at the start of this hearing. Specifically, the charge letter as it was written was vague and did not contain any specific charges for which the claimant could prepare a defense. The hearing has been held outside of the required time limits of the agreement, and so we would repeat those objections as a procedural defect that should essentially should have stopped the hearing, but the hearing officer chose to overrule those for reasons known only to him. The other piece that we would point out is that there is conflicting testimony between the charging officer, Superintendent Lakin, and the Lieutenant Pantoja. Mr. Lakin's testimony was that the date of incident was March the 30th. Again, that specific date could have been cleared up by putting the specifics in a charge letter as is required under the agreement, but that wasn't the case. Lieutenant Pantoja testified that it was April the 2nd. So there's conflicting testimony as it relates to when was the actual date of incident. But the record that was developed today demonstrates that Mr. Blanton, on the day that he was called to perform the janitor duties or to fill the janitor position, at all times when he was able to do that, was performing the duties as was required in the bulletin. However, it seems as though Mr. Blanton was tasked with trying to correct a week's worth of oversight in just 1 day of assignment, which is impossible. Mr. Blanton performed a number of duties associated with his position and which account for the entire of his assigned shift until he became sick. When he became sick, he sat down to take a break, and then Mr. Blanton was observed to be groggy by the charging officer and the lieutenant witness, which explains Mr. Blanton's need or would have explained Mr. Blanton's need to take a break. There's absolutely nothing in the record that indicates Mr. Blanton failed to comply with any instructions. Mr. Blanton's testimony and that of witness Lofton demonstrate that he performed the duties of his position in accordance with the posted job bulletin. Unfortunately, the charging officer failed to recognize any of the tasks that were performed by Mr. Blanton and only provided testimony about his observation of Mr. Blanton at the end of his tour of duty when he was sick. This in no way characterizes Mr. Blanton on the date in question. He performed the duties to the best of his ability and in a manner that was consistent with the posted bulletin. We've heard a lot of testimony and a lot of leading questions from the hearing officer to the charging officer as it relates to sleeping. We've heard a lot of testimony and leading questions from the hearing officer to the charging officer as it relates to properly marking off. We've heard a lot of testimony and questions as it relates to being sick, but ironically, those were never listed as charges against the claimant. So the record will show that claimant was charged with unsatisfactory work performance. However, we have demonstrated that Mr. Blanton, to the best of his ability, performed an overwhelming task, and there's absolutely no basis for the charge. So we would request that the charges be removed from claimant's personnel record and the claimant be reinstated and made whole in every way.
Mr. Hollis, your comments and objection will be made part of the record. They are noted, and again, I'm going to close this hearing at this time. I want to thank everyone for their participation. The time is 3:02 p.m., and we are adjourned.